Hello everyone, this is Dwayne with TechBits. Thanks for tuning in to the very first video of this channel. Here we cover topics such as tech news, gaming, gadgets, reviews, and PC builds, primarily ITX. Today we're going to be covering a small sub 5 liter case. It's the SGPC K39. We'll do a quick build out of the case and we'll see how this thing performs. Alright, let's jump into it. K39 is a very small case. It's the smallest case that I've ever built in. You can buy it on Taobao or AliExpress for around $85 or so. That's factoring in shipping and the included riser cable. Without the riser cable, you can get it for around $55, $60. So it is relatively affordable compared to a lot of other mini ITX cases. Now, as far as building in it, that's a whole nother story. It is a little difficult, at least for people who haven't built in a small ITX case before. So we'll get into those details in a little bit here. As far as build quality, this case is all aluminum, and it comes in multiple different colors. You can get it in red, black, or in my case, I have silver here. The panels themselves can be warped when you receive them, but you can at least bend them back into shape. I know I had to do that a few times for some of the pieces as I was building in order to either fit certain components or just to straighten it back out. So not much to worry about. However, you do want to be careful if you're building in this case because you don't want to warp it out too far. Now this case does require a flex PSU. That is a flex ATX power supply. These are smaller than your SFX or SFXL power supplies that you normally see in many other ITX case builds. For this build, I ended up using the 300 watts Metal Fish 80 plus gold fully modular power supply. I actually ended up switching out the stock fan in the power supply because I found it to be a little too noisy for my taste. I switched it out with a Noctua 20mm fan. I can show how to replace the stock fan on the power supply in another video. Now this case is small, as I mentioned before. Now compared to the Low-Key Ghost S1 and the Metal Fish S3, this case is smaller by far. So why would anyone build in this case? That is a good question. I believe that this is all personal preference. We have a multitude of different kinds of cases, from full-size ATX cases and micro ATX, but for those who are looking for a small design, small profile, let's say you want to save desk space or maybe travel around with it, put it in your backpack or something, this could be a case for you. As I mentioned before, it may not be for beginners. This case itself I struggled with a little bit as I was building. I found that the tabs where you would screw in the panels were in the way, at least for me, when I was trying to put the motherboard in and so on and so forth. So these are some things that you want to keep in mind. Another downside to building a small case like this is you have a limited choice when it comes to graphics cards options. This case can support a dual slot graphics card, but only up to 180mm. That's very small in comparison to a full size, let's say a 2070 Super. Alright, so let's talk components. For the CPU, I ended up going with the Ryzen 5 1600 AF. This is a 12nm refresh of the 1600 CPU. It's equivalent to the performance of the Ryzen 5 2600, albeit a little bit cheaper than the 2600 itself. The reason I went with the 1600 is because it is only 65 watts, as many of the other Ryzen 5 processors are. As far as 65 watts goes, that's kind of what I recommend when it comes to building in, small form factors like this. The reason why is because it's a lot more power efficient and it won't generate as much heat. You can also get by with a smaller power supply. That being said, I do recommend just sticking with 6-core CPUs. However, you could absolutely go up to an 8-core CPU if you wanted. You will notice higher temperatures though. And of course, when we're talking about temperatures, this case supports up to a 47mm height of a CPU cooler. If you wanted to go with an 8-core CPU, it's hard to find cooling solutions for these builds, especially for something like this, when you know that all you have is 47mm to spare. Can't expect too much cooling performance from there. However, in my testing, 6-core CPUs are perfectly fine. For the CPU, we're going to be using the Metalfish Z39. It is a 39mm CPU cooler. Now for me, it is not the quietest fan on there, but you can always change it out with another 92mm fan. I also do recommend using the Noctua L9A or L9I, depending on the CPU that you have. This is a highly rated CPU cooler, and it's also within the specs of mini ITX cases. As mentioned earlier, we are sticking with the Metalfish Flex PSU. This is 300 watts, which is more than enough to power the components that we have inside of this machine. For the RAM, we're going to be using 16 gigabytes of XPG Gamix at 3000 megahertz CL16. For storage, we have an NVMe drive from WD Blue. It is the SN550, 512 gigabytes. This is readily available all over the place and very, very affordable. When I got this case, it came with the riser cable. Now, if you're not familiar with what a riser cable does, is it allows you to mount your GPU in a different location rather than where it traditionally is mounted. For the GPU, we're going to use PNY's Accelerate 1650 Super. And to put it all together, the motherboard that we're going to be using is the Gigabyte Aorus B450i. It is compatible with the 5000 series Ryzen CPUs and below, and has a slot for one NVMe drive. Alright, so earlier I mentioned that it's difficult to build in this case. The reason why it's so difficult is because, obviously, the lack of space. In order to maximize your efficiency and run into as little problems as possible, you need to plan ahead. For example, I ran into issues with this build with the riser cable. I had mounted the motherboard and put all the cables where they need to be and whatnot. However, I totally forgot to plug in the PCIe riser cable. I had to dismantle the entire thing just to put it on because there was no space for me to slide the slim cable over the top of the motherboard. After dismantling it all, I was able to plug in the riser cable into the motherboard and put the riser cable through the hole where it's supposed to in the case. Another tip is to make sure you route your cables and place them in a general vicinity of where they will be plugged in prior to you putting the motherboard in. Another thing to note is case fans. Most ITX cases will have, space for case fans and whatnot. However, this case does not. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Because the case is so small, the GPU and the CPU, with their respective coolers, can draw in cool air directly from outside the case. In contrast, larger cases need the help of case fans in order to draw in that cool air. Now, through my unofficial testing, I found that temperatures were exceptional, but we'll get more on that later. As mentioned earlier, if you've never built a PC before, this case might not be a good starter case. I would recommend starting in maybe another mini ITX case that is easier to build in, or just go with a large ATX case so that you know how all the parts come together. Also, if you've built computers before but have larger hands, this could be very difficult for you as well. Now, if any of those things don't deter you from trying something like this, I'll go ahead and try to give you the step-by-step approach that I took to build into this computer. First, I start with the motherboard. I put on all the components on there, such as the CPU, the cooler, the RAM, and the NVMe drive. Now, depending on the CPU cooler, you may have to put the RAM in and the NVMe drives in first, prior to mounting the CPU cooler. The reason why is because some CPU coolers are larger than others, and this will cover some of the clearance in the areas where you would put the RAM in, for example. When applying thermal paste onto the CPU, I usually go for a cross method, because I found that this seems to be the best way, at least from my testing. Most people will tell you to put a larger than a grain of rice onto the CPU and then mount the cooler and it'll spread it. However, I did find some shortcomings with that and it wouldn't spread throughout the whole CPU. Now I always go with the cross method, and this seems to work for almost all of my builds. After I put the motherboard together, I usually put that aside and get to work on the case. On the case, I will go ahead and mount the power supply and plug in the respective cables onto the power supply itself. From there, I will install the I/O shield onto the back. This is notorious for being forgotten or lost. From there, I will route my cables and try to put them in the general vicinity of where they will plug in after I put the motherboard on. Now, putting the motherboard into this thing was no easy task. I found it difficult because the tabs where the case panel connects to kind of blocked the clearance, at least for me, when I was trying to put the motherboard in. I had to apply a little bit of pressure when I was putting the motherboard in place, and I was afraid that I was going to break something. However, it seemed okay. For this case specifically, you have to plug the PCI riser cable in before you put the motherboard into its space. The reason why is because there is no space or clearance for you to slide that PCI riser cable over the motherboard after you've bolted it down. After you've mounted the motherboard in place, then you can flip it over and mount the PCI riser cable, and then go ahead and pop the GPU into the riser slot. From here, just connect the 6-pin or 8-pin depending on the GPU that you're using. I struggled a little bit when I was plugging the power connector into the GPU, because I realized it was a little short. However, I was able to stretch it out a little bit and get it plugged in, so it all worked out in the end. But there's definitely one thing to note. You want to make sure you get the right length of power cables, because that could limit your ability to actually use the system. You could theoretically buy extensions for the power cables. However, there's not much space in the case itself, so cable management will be much more difficult. After I got the GPU in, I went ahead and screwed it in place. I usually leave the panels off of the case, just in case I run into problems when I first boot it. At this point, it's the moment of truth, and our fingers are crossed. Now we get to the real question. Does this PC, something so small and compact, perform well, especially given that it's only a 300 watt power supply? Well, let's take a look. The short answer is yes, absolutely. It works so well. Now, for a machine this size and the components that are inside, you wouldn't expect it to play a lot of different kinds of games. I didn't run any kind of benchmarks. However, I did use it more in a real case scenario, or let's say the traditional gamer. I tried it first on my ultra-wide monitor. It's an Alienware 34-inch, 3440 by 1440. I then moved on and played some games on a 60Hz Samsung panel, and again, I was just blown away at the numbers. Go ahead and post them here so you can take a look. I mentioned earlier that the temperatures exceeded my expectations. How so? Well, the GPU never went over 70 degrees. I think I saw it hit 68 degrees Celsius max, playing Red Dead Redemption 2. The CPU also maxed out around 58 degrees in my testing, and that was also in Red Dead Redemption 2. My final thoughts on this case is that it's a great case. Like, the size, the build quality, the way it looks, it's very sleek, very small. No one would ever expect it to be some kind of powerhouse to play certain games. Now, if you want full power in this, I don't recommend building in something like this. I would recommend building in a larger small form factor, or you can go into just a larger case in general. However, if you decide that you're just going to be playing on, let's say, medium to high graphics, 1080p, non-competitive, then by all means, I would go for this case. It is affordable, it's available, and quite frankly, it's not too difficult to build in. As long as you plan ahead of time, it'll be fine, I think. Anyway, that's it for the SGPC K39 case. Though it may not be a beginner-friendly case, it was definitely a fun case to build in, and of course, it has its looks. Go ahead and give this video a like if you liked it, and subscribe for future content. Thanks for watching. Kemi, not now, please. Shh. I'm videoing. Quiet. I'm busy. Sorry, my cat wants to get in on this video.